Testing, 1, 2.
See, you go over there, I could be.
Okay. Okay. Testing, 1, 2. David, hi Laura, how are you? Doing well, thank you. Yeah. We'll wait 30 seconds or a minute or two. Other people are coming, and we'll welcome them. Carol made some handouts back there, so hopefully you found one and have it with you. For those of you who do not know me, I'm Jim Augustin, and I am delighted that you're here on this nice, bright, sunny April 30th, Wednesday. And we will be meeting tonight and then the first 3 Wednesdays in May. I assume the weather will get nicer and nicer and nicer. I should also say that Steve is videotaping this and will post it on the Northridge webpage, right, Steve? And you can access it if you have to be away or you want to see it in the privacy of your own home, okay? I will introduce myself in just a second, but for those of you from Northridge, you got a couple of prayer requests today with regard to Cheryl Hatton's brother and Ann Castron. Others of you from other churches may know them. But I think it might be appropriate if we just took a few moments of silent prayer on their behalf before we begin. God's grace be upon them and anybody else in our midst who need an extra measure of care and concern, healing in one way or another. Again, for those of you who don't know me, I guess I'm a cradle Lutheran. I was mentioning to the O'Flynns back here that my mother was a German Lutheran, my dad was a Norwegian Lutheran, and I always accused them of having a mixed marriage. And in the day, that was kind of serious business. It all seems rather quaint now. I also happen to be ordained, but I've been a professor almost all of my professional career, dealing with the religions of the Middle East. And that means primarily Christianity, and early Judaism. And over time, I spent more and more time with Islam, teaching Muslim things. It wasn't in our department until 2001 when we as a department and the powers that be in the institution decided we better hire an Islamicist a Muslim person teaching Islamic things, because this was becoming more and more urgent. What that meant is I had two very close colleagues who were Muslims, but I was probably teaching a little bit less and less in Islamic studies. How this relates to this particular set of presentations is that I also taught in our Global Studies program just about every year a course on the Middle East. And one of the strands in that course had to do with global religious extremism, whether it was Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. So I have been interested in this business of extremism, religiously speaking, for a long time. A year ago this past winter, probably in February, I came upon Tim Alberta's book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in the Age of Extremism. And he was making the rounds at that point to be interviewed and on TV and here and there. And I thought, I need to get this book. And I did, and I read it. And I thought, I need to do something with this. I wasn't exactly sure how I was going to do it. In fact, last summer, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how you could teach from this book, how you could develop some presentations. There's so much in here, you have to be selective and more focused. And hence, this past winter in Portland, I agreed to give 6 one-hour lectures, and it went really very well. But I realized, and I'll repeat this to you, that I'm being selective here. Some of you, I know, have read the book. You don't need to read the book to hopefully get something out of these presentations. I'm being selective, and so on. It is especially interesting, as those of you who have read it, or read the beginning of it know, Tim Alberta is himself an evangelical and comes out of an evangelical background and considers himself today in the church. So he's speaking to his own tribe, so to speak. He's speaking to his own family. He's speaking to himself. His journalism is, I think, existential for him in all of this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I would also like to say something else about this title, American Evangelicals. As I'm sure you people, as I, know many evangelical folks. And what is described in here wouldn't fit them. In other words, when we speak about evangelicals, we have to be careful, I think, because there's a real range of theological perspective, and it would be unfair to lump every evangelical into the same bucket, and it would be just as it would be unfair to put every Episcopalian in the same theological bucket, Lutheran, Presbyterian, disciples folks in the same bucket. That doesn't work very well. So we have to have a modicum of humility about this. Not every evangelical would find them in the same Jerry Falwell camp, for example. So I want to say that up front and kind of go from there. Those of you who have attended my presentations in the past will know that I welcome participation. Hopefully, I will never act defensively to any question or anything I have said. I also know, however, it might be a good idea if I take it upon myself at important or certain junctures just to pause and invite questions. We can have a free-for-all, and that doesn't work for everybody. So what I will try to do is pause periodically so you can raise your questions, your comments, your ideas, and we can have mini discussions along the way. Does that seem like a reasonable procedure? Now, I will try to do something that I can assure you I probably will forget. And that is, when somebody has a question, I will try to repeat it so everybody can hear. Are we good on that? And if I don't, my good wife over here will probably remind me. Are we good on that too? Okay. Can I just ask, how many of you have read some or all of this book? So there are a fair number of you. As I mentioned to Carol, it's not necessary to, rephrase it, I'm assuming that people have not read the book. So if you have read the book and you want to refer to something in the book, you might just describe what that is for the benefit of everybody else, or I'll help you. One other clarification. The title of these lectures are Christian Extremism, the Heresy, and its Consequences. What about the word heresy? I don't know if you have been in places or are inclined to use the word heresy. I can tell you in academic circles, it's not a word you see very often being used. And it's not a word that I have used very often, because sometimes, historically in the church, the things that have at any given point been determined to be heretical turn out down the road a ways to be quite orthodox. And I would like to affirm that in the sense that we might learn some things over time, both positively and negatively. Here, I use it because I think the present moment we are in doesn't give us the privilege of sitting back and simply saying, under the Christian umbrella, anything and everything goes. There are some things that are just beyond any reasonable historic bounds. Now, I am inclined to cast that rather broadly, but there are things that are problematic. So I use the word heresy from a Christian point of view, but I also think that there are some things that are also un-American. We might debate about what those are. That can be healthy and productive. So, there are things that are heretical from a Christian point of view, and I would suggest there are things that are downright un-American from a political, historic point of view. So you will see in the description, I ask the question, how do we untie the Gordian knot regarding the relationship between extremist religion and national politics. You may or may not be familiar with the expression Gordian knot. It goes back about 4 or 5 centuries prior to Christ to Gordius in what is today west central Turkey, and they tied a knot, and the myth has it that anybody who could untie that knot would come to own, capture, subdue all of the rest of Anatolia. And Alexander the Great in the 4th century came. He couldn't untie the knot, but he took his sword and he cut it in two. And we know the story. He conquered all the lands virtually, to what we think of as Afghanistan today, India, and Pakistan. So it's come in common usage to be something that is really difficult to untangle. And hence, extremist religion and national politics. We might state the problem this way. Religion and politics should remain separate because they have the potential to corrupt each other. Religion and politics cannot remain separate because people's fundamental values will and ought to inform the social and political order. Here we are, folks. Maybe you heard in the news today, the Supreme Court heard arguments about using government money to support a Catholic charter school. As long as I've been alive, and that includes most of the rest of you in that umbrella, the courts have tried to figure out where the boundaries are with regard to the establishment or non-establishment of religion and the public order. When I was at the seminary, I haven't gotten wound up yet. I did my internship in Washington, D.C., as some of you may know. And the church where I did the internship rented out its space during the week to one of these private religious schools that was emerging because it was the heyday of busing. And one of my great regrets is that I just didn't sit in on any of those classes just to hear what was being taught. I'm not sure it was all bad. I'm not sure it was all good. But people were escaping in metropolitan Washington, D.C. from the public schools. Julie taught in one of those public schools. It was a difficult year because most of the kids in that community where she taught were African American. They were bussed out and the Korean kids were bussed in. Odd situation. So, what happens when extremist religion, right-wing Christianity in this case, and extremist politics, right-wing American politics, in this case, join hands? What happens when they join hands? And this is the world that Tim Alberta leads us into in his book. And we will follow him into various, in some cases, dark corners of that world. Some of the things you will know about or have with me lived through in the past. And we will examine this and try to think together how to imagine a way of thinking about religion, healthy religion, and the state in this kind of Gordian situation. Okay, I want you to turn to the schedule here. And I would like you to just look at the Roman numeral topics. Tonight I want to think with you about the wider context for this. If we're going to think about his book, it's helpful to have a wider interreligious context to make some sense of this. And then we will hopefully get through tonight Roman numeral number 2. And we will work our way through this whole thing over the next 4 weeks, 3.5 weeks. And at the end, there is a section on Christian freedom, American freedom. You've probably seen this guy on TV too, Timothy Snyder. He is a Yale historian. He's been teaching there for about 20 years. He wrote a little book, a few years ago on tyranny. And this past year or so, he came out with this book on freedom. And you might ask, well, how in the world does that fit into any of this? I read Timothy Snyder's book, a book that, by his own description, he says he had an idea of what this book should look like. He wrote it, took it to his publisher, and they said, this won't work. So he started over, and he made it much more personal, and probably personable, and he almost died in during the period he was writing this. His historical specialty is East Central Europe. He was in the Ukraine, and he was in Poland, and here and there, and he came down with some sort of infection that went septic, and somehow or another he got back to this country. He was misdiagnosed in the beginning. He got back, and he barely made it. So you see that in the book. But the thing that caught my attention is that he talks about freedom right away in this book as not merely freedom from something. He says that has its place, but it's basically a negative notion of freedom. And he goes on to say, we need to think about freedom to, or I would say freedom for. Those of you who know Paul's epistles only have to go to Galatians chapter 5 to see that worked out. Theologically, he didn't go to the Bible. He goes to the Bible at some points in here, but he didn't on that issue go to Galatians 5. But it started to ring bells for me. And I wanted to conclude this because this set of presentations with some discussion of Timothy Snyder, because I think we in this country banter around and bandy around the word freedom here and there, as though its meaning is self-evident. In some cases, we're still fighting the Revolutionary War. Instead of now King George III, we're fighting against Washington, D.C. But the interesting question then in all of this is, what does a notion of freedom enable us to be? And I would say, give glory to God and service to the neighbor. The first and the great commandment, and it works itself out in a whole variety of ways. We stand for something, not just against something. Okay? Okay. I have to be careful. I could start to sound like a preacher here. Those preachers in the crowd. That's not an insult, but you know the rhythm that starts to happen. Okay. In recent days, a lot of attention has been given to issues of religious violence, the rise of religious fundamentalism, friction between global religions, and hence, the notion and character of human freedom. We might think, for example, of Mark Juergensmeyer's book, which I used in the past, teaching, Terror in the Mind of God. Again, I'm casting our vision broadly here. The rise of the global rise of religious violence. We all know that religion, when it jumps the tracks, can really do some awful things. Another book that I've used in the past, Strong Religion, the Rise of Fundamentalisms Around the World. So whatever we think about what's going on in terms of religious extremism within the boundaries of this country, globally, some of the same factors are in play in different religions all at the same time. Kathy, I know you've read this book too. The 10th Parallel. I don't know how much you know or have read about the change in global Christianity, for example, how it's moved south. The heart and center of global Christianity has moved south, and it's moved east. It's no longer centered in Western Europe, Central Europe, and North America. And this has been going on for a long time. If you were to look statistically at how many Christians there were on the continent of Africa in 1900 and compare that number to 2000, it would amaze you how those who identify as Christians have grown, increased. It just so happens that there's been enormous growth in Islam as well. And this book, written by Eliza Griswold, whose father was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, a couple, three bishops back. Eliza Griswold looks at a band around the 10th parallel around the globe, where Islam and Christianity meet. And they often don't meet peaceably. And it isn't just in Africa, the Philippines, right on down the line. It is her story telling about all these interviews about how there are Christians trying to convert Muslims, Muslims trying to convert Christians, and or at least push them back. So, global extremism. Now, the word extremism, I think, has a relativistic quality about it. It certainly connotes in common parlance that which is or is thought to take place on the margins of what is normal, quote unquote, or on the margins of what is traditional, quote unquote. It may also suggest something that can be violent in the service of a larger truth. I sometimes think in our own present culture, and it wouldn't be in this country alone either, but the more fervently and vocally somebody believes something, the more likely it is to be true. We have to watch out for that. I think it's picking my mind. And while Timothy Snyder's work is not specifically about extremism, he argues then for this richer notion of freedom that appears in certain religious traditions. I don't know whether Timothy Snyder would claim to be a Christian or not. I knew he grew up in Ohio. Maybe somebody knows. I'm not sure. But I think he's been influenced by the Apostle Paul. So, it is under this larger religious canopy that Tim Alberta, who is a staff writer for the Atlantic Monthly magazine, I guess it's probably just called the Atlantic now. I go back a ways. It was a monthly magazine. And how extremism seems to have taken root in many corners of American evangelicalism. He lays out the way extremism has held certain corners of Christianity in its grip. And this, of course, will not necessarily surprise us, because if we're pondering this Gordian knot, we can see extremism not only as a religious phenomenon, but maybe also a political phenomenon. Okay. Alberta does not presume, I think, those of you who have read the book or are reading it might have a different view than I. I don't think he presumes to know how to untie this thorny knot between religious extremism and political extremism, or just religion and politics. He's here to investigate it and describe it in terms of his own reporting. Okay, let me just pause here for a moment. Ideas, questions, thoughts? Some of you have heard me make this claim before, I'm sure. If you're wondering whether I can talk nonstop for an hour and a half, rest at ease. I can. I can do it. I prefer not to, but I can. Okay, let's move on. I think it is probably a mistake. It's probably a mistake to assume that religious extremism, or political extremism for that matter, is simply irrational. You know, it's very easy to say, this kind of religious expression, this kind of political, it's got to be nutcase irrational. And I must confess, in the privacy of my own home and the quiet of my own living room, I go there all too frequently. Now, here's the scary thing, and this has been around a long time, so we're behind the curve on this. The other day we got new phones. Julie's sitting over there, and she's doing something on her phone, and we're visiting. Pretty soon the phone is recording everything we have said. It wasn't bad, it was just a frightening prospect. Okay, it seems to me a better approach to this issue is to try and understand what drives certain people. Try to find the points of origin from which our disagreements might emerge. I've often felt that way about biblical interpretation. If you're visiting with somebody and they have a very different interpretation of a certain biblical text or set of biblical text, or the whole Bible for that matter, rather than just arguing about it, it's more interesting to dig down to what are the assumptions that we or they bring to these texts. Because it's probably going to, the interpretations are probably going to work themselves out from those prior assumptions. Okay. I think it's helpful, again, looking at this broader thing beyond Tim Alberta's book, to look at some of the features of extremism that other authors here have talked about. From a social point of view, for example, extreme fundamentalist groups often exhibit what has been described as an enclave mentality. Us against them. We're in the enclave. And it's those people out there are not like us. They're out there. They see themselves separated from the larger culture, and the larger culture is seductive, it's evil, it's a secular culture that threatens to pollute the community. Now, this isn't a new phenomenon. You can go back to any century back to the Protestant Reformation, and you can go long before that too. We have, coming just out of the Reformation traditions, real differences about how different groups are going to respond to the larger culture. And in extreme situations, that enclave idea results in the putting up of boundaries. Do we have any Methodists here? Yeah, good. I'm speaking to at the Methodist Church tomorrow. We used to have a friend. He was a fellow student with me in a graduate program. And Dave was a Free Methodist pastor, not United Methodist, Free Methodist. And I didn't know anything about the Free Methodists at all. And I said, what about the church which you served? And he said, well, how many members did you have? Oh, I think there were 125 or 50. How many people do you have at a Sunday service? 250. They had a very different notion of participation as distinct from being inside. And there was a long process to become a member of the inside. This business is not new, but it is often tied up with this business of religious extremism. In this business of insiders and outsiders, the enclave and borders and boundaries, distinctions are often blurred. They see the larger culture here where their traditional distinctions they see as being blurred. For example, gender distinctions. Clear boundaries melt away between right and wrong as they perceive it. And God and God's will are largely being ignored. From their enclave perspective, they look out on the larger culture as hostile, as a threat to pollute the purity and the truth of those on the inside. Enclave Protestants see people drifting away from the church. We could probably all see that. Drifting away from the church to what is often described as secular humanism. I'm in the church, but I'm a bit of a secular humanist myself. And even those who stay in the church can best be described as lukewarm. From that perspective, that's what you see. In response, the enclave community sets up firm, recognizable boundaries to protect itself from the alluring temptations of the larger community. As has been described, the morally superior enclave community sets around itself a wall of virtue to surround the community of the saved and to preserve itself from the temptation of the world outside. The reality inside is good, the reality outside is bad. Good and evil stand opposite each other, and there is no mistaking which is which and who is who. It's not unique to Christian groups. Think about late 20th century Iran. The Shah was secularizing the country. He had oil. He could buy this and buy that. And then he came to the White House state dinner put on by Jimmy Carter. And he went home and was shortly thereafter overthrown by Ayatollah Khomeini. What we apparently didn't understand is that the religious community was not necessarily following the Shah. I mean, here we are now, 40, 50 years later. In other words, there's no room, whether it's Christian enclave mentalities or Islamic or some Jewish enclave mentalities as well, for complacency. Damnation is real and it's seductive. Going along with this worldview is normally a turn to literalist, fundamentalist readings of Scripture. Ambiguity and the lack of certainty about Scripture and theology only feed into the confusion associated with secular humanism and must be resisted. Maybe we can talk about this later too, but in the political season of this past fall, reporters would sometimes, not Tim Alberta, maybe he was doing it too, but other reporters were going and visiting with very, very conservative Christian groups. And they would speak about the election as a matter of life and death. And I don't think they were hoping for Kamala. Given everything that is at stake in this mindset, you can't sit on the fence. You're either with the right and the good, or you are against it.
Jim,
Yes, David.
what does the leadership look like with something like that?
I'm going to move on, hopefully, more directly to leadership.
Yeah.
Okay? You see, it looks very bleak to these people, but not all is lost. Christian civilization can be turned around and made great again. This is provided the Bible and prayer get back into the public schools, and the 10 Commandments are prominently displayed in public places. You haven't seen that around, have you? No. This, of course, it seems to me, opens the door to all kinds of Christian nationalism, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamic tendencies. Often come to the fore as well, I think. And they come to the fore often with a vengeance. This is a Christian country, after all, right? You know, I was listening to some lectures on American history. Way back when, I taught American history for a while, and the lecturer, I think, is from Emory University, who said, in the very beginning of this country, we think it was overwhelmingly Christian. He said, the evidence points to maybe 15% of the people went to church, and the religious people, many of them, the founders of this country, were not Orthodox Trinitarian Christians. They were deists, if they were anything. It wasn't until the First Great Awakening, Cotton Mather and all those folks. I'm not sure, personally, what it means to say that a country is Christian. Even if I was inclined to say that, I'm not sure what it means. I can understand that this is a country that has a lot of Christians in it, and quite a few Jews, and increasingly numbers of Muslims and Buddhists, and none of the above. As we know, polls tell us the largest growing religious group is nuns, and not N-U-N, N-O-N-E. They don't consider themselves religious in any respect. Okay. Now, it's very easy then, with this kind of dualistic mindset, to see anything or anyone who is different as problematic. And we know in this country that skin color has played a role, a huge role in difference. We also know that current debates over immigration are not new in this country. The 1920s was a time where immigration was a flashpoint. But what changed I guess it was in the 1960s, when Lyndon Johnson was president, the immigration laws changed and opened up the opportunity from people from non-traditional European countries to immigrate to this country. Difference can be a problem, not always, but it can be a problem if you hunker down behind your own wall of virtue. Now, in these kinds of enclave communities, the issue of authority is crucial. That is, beyond the authority of the text, beyond the authority of Scripture, for example. There are the people who lead these communities who have invested in them or acquired some notion of authority. Authoritative figures. Sometimes this leadership is a small group of men, but perhaps most often it is a single person. Not always, but virtually always a man. I'm hedging here a bit. By and large, women need not apply. Now, there are a few exceptions to that, but it's true in Christian nationalism, Christian extremism, and other religious groups as well. Sometimes the leader has formal training, but the most crucial factor is personal charisma. Charisma. How this leader thinks, reads Scripture, and presents the Word is absolutely critical. I spent a lot of time among Midwestern Lutheran pietists, and I would chuckle often, maybe to myself, maybe nobody else observed this, but I sometimes felt like if you were really in tune with these Midwestern pietists, debates over doctrine were kind of irrelevant. It was the tone of your voice, your sense of sincere piety that often carried the day. Now, I could be very unfair, but I think I was pretty close to it. And those of you who know that part of the world. You see, how the leader reads Scripture and presents the Word is critical. But if the leader wishes to stay in good standing in the community, to stay in good standing in the community, there is very little room for free thinking. That can be a problem. And Tim Alberta, if we read Tim Alberta's book, the many examples of these kinds of churches that he writes about and reports on are almost always led by a male authority figure. And when that authority figure flames out, or when he changes his mind and moves in a different theological direction, the people tend to get up and leave. They're not interested in being challenged. They're not interested in changing their minds about something. They want the leader to confirm what they already believe to be true. If not, see ya. Leadership does not rotate in these kinds of groups, as it does in most other kinds of Christian communities. In the United States, many of these kinds of churches become over time mega churches. Huge mega churches. Exceedingly wealthy, using the latest technology, and often willing to preach what is sometimes called the prosperity gospel. You might just get rich if you stay with us. The good Lord will bless you. That's why the language of saying you are blessed in many corners has a negative connotation for people. Which is kind of interesting when you think about the prosperity gospel in megachurches. Not far from where we are in Portland, when we're there, we go by a church, Southwest Bible Church. You can't believe the parking lot and all the cars. I dare not say any more because I really don't know that much more, but I wonder what goes on there. If there isn't just a touch of the prosperity gospel. And you can drive around Kalispell and see some pretty nice cars. You go out there and you see really nice cars. Just saying. And we all drive nice cars. Relatively globally, we're all driving nice cars. But here it is. And the interesting thing about this to me is, in the cases of these kinds of communities that preach the prosperity gospel, you have this strange amalgam of things. You know, a strange mix of boundary building, apocalyptic conservatism. When some of us were in college, The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey was a bestseller, and the reading of biblical prophecy and the fulfilling of biblical prophecy and so on and so forth, it was attracting a whole lot of people. It sort of died out, but it's come back in different form, I think. And you have that kind of apocalypticism tied up with material prosperity, and it is world affirming and denying all at the same time. It seems kind of strange to me. Okay. Any comments? Anybody want to? Yes. Tell me your name again.
My name is Caitlin.
Caitlin?
I am a product of this sort of extremism.
Mm-hmm.
Grew up homeschooled, fundamentalist, all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's limiting to say the prosperity gospel is focused on just getting wealthy. I think there is a more insidious prosperity gospel,
Okay.
which is if you can distinguish yourself by your purity, that is going to lead to a good life here on earth, but not necessarily financial wealth.
Mm-hmm.
But
Good point. Can everybody hear her?
yeah,
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm recovering from a cold. So my voice is very
And I had promised that I would repeat them. So.
yeah. So I just wanted to kind of.
Good point. I think that makes perfectly good sense. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good. Anything else? David?
That refers then to getting to heaven.
Yes,
I mean, that's a part of the prosperity, right?
part of it, yeah.
It refers to, David said, getting to heaven as part of the prosperity. Yeah. Okay. You can see how in our own immediate context in this country, we have a whole lot of different religious things going on. And globally, the same thing is going on. Have any of you, or very many of you, traveled in Africa to any great extent? Attended churches in the bush or wherever? I mean, it's interesting. It can be very interesting in many ways. How that kind of developing world fervor that in many ways I think is healthy, but they don't have all the things we have that sort of get in the way. The trappings of the good life, that we all have. I remember way up in northern South Africa, just right up by the Zimbabwe border, staying at a Bible camp, and the next morning we were going to walk to this church, and people just started streaming out of the bush to this church. The women in the most beautiful garb you can imagine on one side, the men on another. And I was with some colleagues, and we were visiting, sitting there, and the presider and preacher was going to preach in Vendese and English. And we sat down, and we're kind of good, stayed back, upper Midwest Lutherans, and all of a sudden, the singing started. Unbelievably beautiful. And then the service went on, and the preacher started to preach, and he'd preach for a while in Vendese, and then he'd, I guess, translate, or he switched over. Maybe he wasn't saying the same thing. I don't know. Preach in English for a while. And and this took a long time. He was going on for probably 40 minutes, and lo and behold, about 2/3 of the way through, he was getting wound up, and he was preaching first in English, then translating into Vendese, and back and forth. And it was so seamless. I thought, this is really interesting, if not unbelievable. And it wouldn't necessarily work in Moorhead, Minnesota. Okay, again, I am mindful of the time here. And I'm going to skip some things that I have, but we've covered them in some ways. It's true, and again, it bears repeating, that not all kinds of unusual things religiously end up turning to violence. They don't. Most of us here go back far enough in the abortion debate. Remember how things turned violent there. And there was a Lutheran pastor who was arrested and convicted of trying to, I think, firebomb an abortion clinic. Some of those issues, you see, are intimately tied up with the social and political world and the religious world. I think the pastor's name was Bray. And I don't remember which brand of Lutheran he was, but this doesn't necessarily go that direction, always or inevitably. And so I say, perhaps we can say there is a continuum in the way religious people engage their larger societies and the political systems in which they live. From absolute and strict separation of religion and politics on one end, and we might think of Ron Reagan, you know who he is? He's on TV once in a while giving his commercial for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And then to the great cosmic struggle between good and evil, and the world must be violently combated at every turn. Religious territories. There is a continuum, I think, between those who see separation, those who see less so. The one thing that places them all on this continuum, however, is the way people's own religious beliefs and convictions, or absence thereof, cause them to engage the state or the larger society. The thing that moves them along the slide rule of this continuum from one end to the other, left to right, is the degree to which people think the state ought to be influenced or controlled by their own personal religious or philosophical beliefs. And I think in our current climate, we can see how this plays itself out in so many different ways. Both religiously and politically. We can think politically of urban and rural divides among people with different, the divides between people of different educational levels, the divides between more progressive religious folks and people more traditional and fundamentalist, with more traditional fundamentalist perspectives, and the fear and frenzy around immigration and the whole issue of difference, especially by people who do not look like us. You know, maybe this is true of some of you as well. I am the grandson and great-grandson of immigrants. Norwegian and German. The thing they all had in common is that they had white skin. They didn't come with anything, money, material goods. They didn't speak the language. And the US government gave them plots of land to homestead. Now, a lot of those homesteaders didn't make it and they left. My relatives made it and they gathered up all these abandoned homesteads or bought or whatever, however they got it, and they succeeded. But it was a tough road, and I think it's interesting that the German side went to the German Lutheran Church and the Norwegians went to the Norwegian Lutheran Church, and there were Catholics and Presbyterians and Episcopalians strewn into this north central Montana rural community. There were a lot of people there in the day of homesteading. Today, there's hardly anybody left. The farms have gotten so big, and the churches died, were closed, and when my dad and my mom decided to get married, it was a mixed marriage. I grew up in among the Norwegian Lutherans because the woman in that patriarchal world went to the husband's church. Now, I was relieved about that in a lot of ways for myself, but my Norwegian grandfather, who grew up in the fjords, when he was probably 60, rented the farm and the ranch to his eldest son, and they moved to Seattle. And whenever we went to visit, if there was a ship in the harbor and had an open house, we were there. My grandfather may have thought north central Montana was the best place on the face of the earth, but he had salt water in his veins. Viking heritage. And I'm sure, Craig, he couldn't have sailed a rowboat or any other kind of little sailboat anywhere, but he knew something pretty deep in his DNA about that. And interestingly enough, I don't want to make this overly personal, but I did not grow up among Lutherans who refused to dance, refused to play cards, refused to consume alcohol, at least publicly, or any of that. These were partying Norwegians. And they had a great time in those early days. And I don't know how my Norwegian grandmother ever survived. She grew up, born south of Fargo, North Dakota. First, her father left them, went to Alaska to dig for gold. And it wasn't long after one of her sisters, her closest in age, died in the Spanish flu. And then my grandmother was farmed out to a neighbor who may have been a relative, and she went to Seattle to teach dance. Can you imagine? And my grandpa from Norway came and worked in the area, married my grandmother, and she went out to Montana and raised 4.5 kids. One child died in a horse accident at 7. And lo and behold, when Julie and I got married, we were out there, and my grandparents were out there in the summer. My new bride was talking to my grandma, and she went like this to a hill in the yard, and it was green. She said, "You know why that's green? It's where I used to go and sit and cry. That's why it's green." And here was really, in old age, kind of an elegant woman. How does that relate to any of this? I think it relates in the sense that whatever's going on, wherever you are, if religion is going to be part of the community, it is really affected by the circumstance on the ground in which you live. They may party all Saturday night. Sunday morning, they were in church. Now, Tim Alberta begins that opening chapter in his book about his own religious experience and his father's death. Tim Alberta asks the question that not only perplexes him, but I suspect perplexes many of us as well. Quote, he writes, polling showed that born-again Christian conservatives, once the president's, that is Donald Trump's, softest backers, were now his most unflinching advocates. Why?
They had a voice.
Hmm?
I think they had a voice.
Yeah, could be. They had a voice. But this is what's driving Tim Alberta's journalistic search here. And The answers to this question, I think, are at the heart of this book. Written by a practicing journalist and a practicing Christian conservative. As a believer in Jesus Christ, and as the son of an evangelical minister, Tim Alberta has struggled existentially with this kind of a question. How could this kind of religious and political devotion be? Somebody had a voice that they didn't have before, perhaps. I think he sketches out a whole lot of other issues here as well. He couldn't, as he says in this chapter, he couldn't just write off all evangelical Christians that he had known summarily as hypocrites. He couldn't do that. He didn't think that would be fair, or would it be accurate. Rather, the evangelicals he knew were plotted on a wide spectrum, he says, of views and motivations. Some were clear-eyed. Some of these evangelicals that he knew were clear-eyed in understanding that supporting Donald Trump pragmatically did not require them to support him and his actions unconditionally. Whereas others willingly set their Christian credibility aside and supported him unconditionally. So there was a continuum of folks that he knew. But most of the evangelicals that he had known in this church, where his father was a pastor for many, many years, and had mentored him and he'd been close to, they were somewhere in the middle of this mix. In a personal and heartfelt turn, Alberta makes clear to the reader that this question why is not merely an abstraction or simply out there somewhere. He grew up in this conservative evangelical home in a suburb of Detroit where his father had served for many years in this evangelical Presbyterian church. His father's sudden death and his return to his home congregation precipitated numerous encounters with longtime friends and mentors in the church who revealed their right-wing political leanings. Some questioned his faithfulness because he didn't share their political leanings. Sometimes even implying, rather bluntly perhaps even, that he had gone astray and what happened to him. But often reassuring him that forgiveness was still possible. Needless to say, this was exceedingly difficult for Tim Alberta, especially in the midst of his own grief over his beloved father's death. He goes through this experience and he writes about his own father's turn to political conservatism, where the conservative brand of American patriotism had increasingly merged with his own brand of evangelical conservatism. As we all know, there is a range of notions of patriotism, just as there is a range of evangelicalism. In effect, the American flag, as he says for his father, was being superimposed on the Christian cross, or vice versa. Being a faithful Christian meant being a conservative American patriot, which meant being a Trump supporter. The rationalization for this may vary among the people in the congregation, but this was the net effect. To deny any part of that construct meant being unchristian, unpatriotic, or probably both. Dealing with this was a struggle for Alberta, but out of it came his research and reporting on what had happened in and to American evangelicalism. It's a complex, those of you who have read it know it's a complex and in many ways disheartening story, if not a frightening story, both for Christianity and the United States of America. To illustrate, last summer, not this summer, last summer, and maybe they're all over the place. I just happened to see this one bumper sticker. It said, I saw this bumper sticker that juxtaposed the cross and the flag. And the caption read, "I will abandon neither one." The real message could not have been clearer, I think, that somehow these were so intimately connected. That you have this kind of not so subtle Christian nationalism. And then what does that do for all those Americans who don't see themselves as Christians, or certainly not Christian nationalists? Jews, Muslims, nuns, Buddhists, Hindu folks. I note that Tim Alberta subtitles his book, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. In an age of extremism. But what is evangelicalism? Here we can read what Tim Alberta writes on pages 10 and 11. I think we have time to do this in his book. In search of answers to that question, I took Dad's advice and pivoted away from political journalism. There could be no sequel to the Trump book. He had written a book about Trump before. Moving my young family back to Michigan a few months after the funeral, I knew there was another project that demanded my attention. Dad had implored me to apply my talents to subjects of more eternal significance. And I could think of nothing more eternally significant than the crack-up of the American Evangelical Church. This would be an examination of Christianity writ large. Whatever the problems plaguing the Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, the Black Church, the rainbow-flying Progressive Church, and there are many, these are distinctive and diverging faith traditions. What I could offer was a window into my faith tradition. It happens to be the tradition that is the most polarizing and the least understood tradition that is more politically relevant and domestically disruptive than all the others combined. To be certain, to a certain extent, definitional overlap does exist. Some Catholics self-identify as evangelical, given the social connotations. Some non-white Christians count themselves as evangelicals due to denominational background or theological disposition, though research shows most black Christians are far likelier to identify as born again than evangelical. A look at the broader Christian church would be incomplete without investigating and contextualizing these convergences. Yet a look at the broader Christian church would not yield a satisfying explanation of the turmoil surrounding within its commanding faction of conservative white Protestants. However imperfect, the designation for brevity's sake, these are evangelicals whom I set out to chronicle following my father's death. It is interesting to note that this evening we are sitting in the sanctuary of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And that term, historically evangelical, as we use it, does not come out of an Anglo British strain, but a German European strain of the term evangelisch, which basically meant Protestant in that context. But it has stimulated a debate as to whether or not the Lutheran Church ought to eliminate evangelical from its name simply because the term in our context so identifies it with maybe extremism. I don't know. I think the answer is we're going to keep it probably. Is that right? Is that?
We used to giggle a little bit about that because you would know where the Lutheran's coming from when they say evangelical versus evangelical.
Yeah, you could tell. There was a debate in the beginning of the merger how we're going to pronounce this. Evangelical, I guess, was the... So we're not evangelical, we're evangelical. Okay. But this whole business of what evangelicalism is or means, he goes on and discusses even further. I won't take the time to drag you through that, but there's a lot of, there's considerable debate about that. But I think the important point here is that you see, no, let me rephrase this. When Tim Alberta describes in his title, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism, I don't think that the groups he's describing are simply evangelical in an age of extremism. They are extreme. And I think, I'll put my cards on the table. I think that we're all functioning in a world of extremism, I suppose, but it's different if you're part of the extreme. Does that make any sense? There is a scene in there, and many of you could probably resonate to this. Greg, I'm sure could. He was in his home congregation, and there was an associate pastor. Pastor Winians is his name, and he was not a happy camper there working with Tim's dad, because he was much more progressive, not an evangelical conservative, and it was a real struggle. And I don't remember if it came from Winians or Tim Alberta saw it in the church. When active servicemen would come home to the church, and they would be treated as heroes. No problem with that. That makes a great deal of sense. When missionaries came home, they got the golf clap. And he thinks, I think, that represented a kind of overbalancing in a particular direction. Our time is about up. But Lynn.
Jim, sometime during this series, would you address the issue of power and how important God is to the concept of power, and how Help my failing memory from one week to the next. Yeah, the issue is power, and how we think about divine power, how we think about earthly power, and just generally we know that you may be concerned with earthly power issues, but if you can infuse them with divine power, you put it on steroids. I think that issue ought to come up again and again and again. Linda, help me with that issue of memory, okay? Any other observations here?
Well, just a question. You talked about extremism through history and how it's contextual given what people are living through, and it's global. So why is it over the last 50 years or so globally, is it economic? What's driving the age of extremism on that level? You have 20 seconds to answer that.
Well, first of all, extremism is not new. It has simply ebbed and flowed and taken on and morphed and taken on different forms. You can go back to the first century in the Holy Land, or it wasn't called the Holy Land then, but in Jerusalem, when in the first Jewish-Roman War, there were Jews called Sicarii, dagger men. They'd have a dagger in their cloak, and they would melt into kill somebody and melt into the crowd. They didn't have explosives, but they were terrorists in the service of a kind of ethnicity. Zealot Judaism in the first century. You can go back earlier than that, but down through the centuries, extremism has, as I say, has ebbed and flowed. I think that some of these extremist things sort of burn themselves out. Not all of them, or they just go into eclipse for a while. But when there is fear and uncertainty and confusion and so on and so forth, political and social, people kind of move into these spaces, I think. Another book I read, I don't have it with me, by Tom Friedman, you know, the New York Times columnist. He grew up in St. Louis Park, Minnesota. And I've always kind of, while we're living in Minnesota, been very interested in kind of following him. But a few years ago, he's written many books, but he wrote a book entitled Thanks for Being Late. And he lives in, I don't know, Montgomery County, the northern suburb of Washington, D.C., and his office was downtown. His office was downtown, and he'd set up appointments over breakfast in the city, not far from his office. And so he'd go in, and he'd get there, and invariably, the person he was going to meet was late. So he could get exasperated and all that, but he thought, you know, this is a blessing. I can kind of think here a little bit. The gist of the book is that with the technological revolution we have lived through, are living in, the great revolution, greatest revolution probably since the Industrial Revolution, is this digital information revolution. And so he goes to Intel, just out there, and speaks to Intel folks and so on and so forth. The upshot is, we have so accelerated life, business, professions, one thing and another, that it has outstripped our social and political institutions to change and keep up. And so there's this, I think, disconnect, or people are sort of disconcerted about all this because we're all a little disoriented. Is Carol trying to?
No, I'm thinking, I was gonna say something that I debated about.
Okay. I promise. You see, the danger of having taught a long time, you have more illustrations than you know what to do with. But I read an article by early on in my teaching career, by a so-called media ecologist. I'm not quite sure what that is, but a media ecologist, and she wrote this article. There are two reasons why species disappear. One is you don't have enough information. The dinosaurs didn't have enough intake in terms of information to learn how to adapt and survive. Maybe. The other one is too much information. Too much random information. Narratives have broken down. It's just coming at us so fast, so randomly, we don't know how any of this really fits together to tell our life story as a society or as individuals.
Or the day. Or the day.
Yeah, I mean, and so that's the gist of Tom Friedman's book. And it's hard then for societies and communities to survive.
So is your point that the technological revolution is driving extremism? Is that your
I think it can in some very concrete ways, but it provides an environment. There is an environment where people are disconnected, disoriented, and maybe even confused because things are happening so far and fast around them that it's hard for them to make sense. You know, you can be an accountant in this country, have a really nice job, but there have been times it's just done remotely somewhere else, anywhere in the world. Am I
Well, I wasn't sure you quite answered this gentleman's question. He was wondering what leads to the rise of extremism around the world. And maybe that's going to take 90 minutes to answer.
I'm not sure that technological advance drives it. It can, maybe, but it complicates our ability to learn how to live with each other.
And there were periods geopolitically where there were big dampers put on, during the Cold War and others, on extremism in different pockets as people were aligned with those superpowers.
Yeah. When that went away,
And the information exploded.
yeah. Steve?
I think technology drives extremism in a way. It's a catalyst, not a cause necessarily.
That's a good word.
Things like social media or message boards or whatever, it gives an opportunity for people to communicate from far away with each other, and they tend to coalesce into groups, people that think alike.
Well, you're subject to the algorithm.
Yeah, right. The whole algorithm.
The algorithm, you might be interested in X, Y, or Z.
Right, so you get into, where is Facebook, and started out as a nice innocent way to share photos of your family. It turned out to be a place to call people dirty names if they didn't agree with what you were saying,
Yeah, and people have a different ethic
Right.
online, it seems like.
Something you wouldn't say to somebody's face, like you're right, they say it online.
And now, maybe you'll get this. We're in the age of A1.
You don't mean steak sauce.
I don't mean steaks. Yeah. And just the other day, I heard, most of what I know I get from public radio. So you have to excuse that. But is it in the state here where they are dealing with legislation that it is a crime to take somebody else's information, run it through AI, and they can portray you in a lewd or compromising position. You don't have to go back too far where that would have been very difficult. But now a machine's doing it.
Well,
Are we making any progress on this here? If we could solve this problem, we'd be really wealthy.
well, some of my former colleagues in higher ed, they're extremely frustrated for the inability to have time to process, think through with others because of the explosion of this rapid knowledge. Because I know when I was in higher ed, we got together with people from other departments and we would wrestle with ideas. And we thought we were really instilling this critical thinking into our, helping our students to critically think. And now, I just hear from a lot of my former colleagues, their frustration of that no longer exists where, I once was, or something. So it bothers me.
Yeah, sure. And there, nursing, for example, many technical fields, by the time students in those fields get out, some of the information they've been taught is out of date because of the technology driving, learning, and how do you keep up? When I left teaching, we were still in the just to running segments of papers through a program to make sure they hadn't bought it.
Right.
Now A1 is writing it for them, and they're trying to figure it out. You don't have time to talk with colleagues. You're too busy validating stuff. Yeah. Okay. Gary?
5-second question. 5 seconds. Where would you throw fundamentalism into the two things we've been talking about, extremism and evangelicalism, and also how technology may be driving it towards fundamentalism as well?
Did everybody hear that? How does the issue of fundamentalism enter into this equation and drive this?
You don't need to answer now. I just want to bring that up.
I'm getting to the age, Gary, where I may not remember it tomorrow. Let me just react here. Fundamentalism is a complex topic as well, just generally. And I taught college kids for a long time who religiously, theologically, and just personally were all over the map. I would say most of them who claimed to be Christian were fundamentalists, not by conviction, but by default. They had never been exposed to anything else. And so they weren't willing to die on that mountain of fundamentalism, but they'd say, I've never heard of anything else. So if you want, again, if you're living in a world where you need some kind of stability and certainty, in a world that seems to be flying apart at the seams, you might want to go to the Word of God, King James Version, and die on that rock. Well, when you do that, it may give you a sense of stability, but I think it's a false one. And it doesn't open up the possibilities of the text very readily. That's my take on that. I'll stay here and talk forever, but People have to go places. You have things to do. Well, you know, in some cultures, they stamp their feet, one of their feet, and if they don't like it, they throw their shoe at you.